The radio said it plainly. No drama, no buildup. The announcer read it like a weather report. The United States government was tightening grain export restrictions. Trade tensions with the Soviet Union had reached a pressure point, and Washington had decided the leverage was worth using. For the farmers listening over breakfast in the spring of 1985, the news landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were immediate. Exports froze, and within days, prices fell. Margaret Holt heard the announcement at 6:14 in the morning, standing at the kitchen counter in her farmhouse outside Abilene, Kansas. She had a cup of coffee in one hand and a loan statement in the other. The numbers on the paper didn't change. The radio numbers would. She had purchased 640 acres the previous year, the neighboring Kellerman parcel, when land values were still inflated by a decade of optimism. The Federal Land Bank had financed most of it at a fixed interest rate of 12.5%. That rate wasn't going anywhere. Neither was the quarterly payment, $9,400, due the 1st of July, October, January, and April. She had circled each date on the calendar in red pen, not out of anxiety, but out of discipline. The dates were fixed. Everything else was variable. Her original plan for the 1985 season was straightforward. Plant the full combined acreage, her original 480 acres plus the new 640, in winter wheat just as she had done for 8 years. Monocropping at scale reduced per acre operating cost. One seed type, one herbicide program, one equipment setup, one buyer relationship with the Consolidated Grain Elevator 12 miles east on Route 56. The math had worked in 1982, 1983, and 1984. The plan assumed the math would keep working. The export freeze was a direct strike at that assumption. Futures boards don't lie slowly. By the end of the first week after the announcement, soft red winter wheat had dropped $0. 38 per bushel on the Chicago Board of Trade. By the end of the second week, it was down $0. 61 from pre-freeze levels. The market was pricing in what every grain economist already understood. American wheat had been flowing east to Soviet buyers at volumes that now had nowhere to go. Domestic storage was not built to absorb the surplus. The elevator at Consolidated began limiting daily intake almost immediately. First to 5,000 bushels per day, then to 3,000. Margaret drove out to the elevator on a Wednesday. She wasn't hauling grain. Her bins were still holding last fall's harvest, waiting on price. She went to talk to Dale Pryor, the elevator manager, a man who had been buying grain from her family since the 1960s. "How long do you think before they lift it?" she asked. Dale picked up a pencil and tapped it against the desk twice before setting it down. "I don't know that they will," he said. "Not this year." She drove home with that answer and didn't say it out loud again for 3 days, but she was calculating the whole time. Her bins held approximately 42,000 bushels of last year's wheat. At pre-freeze prices, $3.40 per bushel, that inventory was worth $142,800. At current futures levels, $2.79 per bushel, it was worth $117.80. That was a paper loss of $25,620, sitting in metal bins behind her barn. She hadn't sold it yet. But every week she held it, she was betting the price would recover. Every week the freeze continued, that bet got worse. And the spring planting decision was already pressing. She had to commit seed and inputs to the ground within weeks. Planting decisions made in April locked in cost structures that wouldn't resolve until harvest in June and July. She couldn't know in April what prices would be in July. Nobody could. But the structure of her bet mattered enormously. If she planted the full 1,120 acres in wheat, she was doubling down on a market that was already under pressure. High yield meant little if price collapsed. She knew that. She had known it academically for years. Now the market was making her know it practically. Behind the equipment shed, under a canvas tarp that had been there since at least 1978, sat an old John Deere grain drill, a 1963 model, mechanical, not hydraulic. Her father had bought it used in 1971 and used it through the late 70s before switching to a newer pneumatic drill better suited to high-volume, single-crop planting. The old drill had been sitting ever since. The new pneumatic drill was calibrated and optimized for wheat. Changing seed types on it wasn't impossible, but it was slow. It required recalibration of seed metering, adjustment of openers, and often a half day of lost time per transition. At scale, the efficiency argument for staying with one crop was real. The new drill made monocropping cheaper per acre. That was its design. The old drill worked differently. The mechanical seed plates and adjustable finger pickups could be reconfigured by hand in under an hour. Spacing could be changed with a wrench and a chart. Seed rate could be dialed up or down manually. It was slower to operate, maybe 20% slower per acre, than the pneumatic. But it didn't lock you into a single crop. It could plant wheat in the morning and oats in the afternoon, with a lunch break and an adjustment. Margaret pulled back the tarp on a Saturday and looked at the machine for a long time before she touched it. The idea she was working through wasn't complicated, but it was uncomfortable. She was considering splitting her acreage, not dramatically, not a dozen crops across a patchwork of small plots, but a deliberate division. Perhaps 600 acres of wheat, perhaps 300 acres of grain sorghum, perhaps 200 acres of oats, which had a smaller domestic market but were more insulated from export policy. Maybe some acreage in sunflowers, which were sold largely through domestic crushing operations rather than export channels. The logic was straightforward. Different crops had different buyers, different price mechanisms, different exposure to the same policy shock. The export freeze was hurting wheat because American wheat had become deeply integrated into Soviet grain purchasing. Sorghum exports were also affected, but the domestic feed market provided a partial floor. Oats were almost entirely domestically consumed. Sunflowers had their own supply chains. Diversification wouldn't protect her from a general economic downturn, but it would prevent a single policy decision from hitting every dollar of revenue at once. She sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started doing the math, real math. Not optimistic projections, worst-case math. Column 1, full wheat monocrop. 120 acres at an expected yield of 38 bushels per acre, she was being conservative, came to 42,560 bushels. If prices recovered to 3 hours, 20 by July, that was $136,192 gross. Input cost for the season, roughly $52,000 in seed, fertilizer, herbicide, and fuel. Gross margin, $84,192. Loan service for the year, $37,600. Net operating income, approximately $46,592. That scenario required prices to partially recover. Column 2, same inputs, no price recovery. Wheat at $2, 79 per bushel. Same yield. Gross, 118,740 taus. Same inputs. Gross margin, 66,740 taus. Same loan service. Net, 29,540 taus. Thinner but survivable. Column 3, prices fell further to $2, $50. Not unprecedented in supply glut situations. Gross, $106,400. Margin, $54,400. Net after loan service, $16,800. That was a bad year. Not a catastrophic one, but close enough to the edge that a dry August or an equipment breakdown would push her into deficit. Column 4 was the one that mattered. What if she diversified and wheat prices kept falling? She spent 2 hours on column 4. Diversified plan. 600 acres wheat, 260 acres grain sorghum, 160 acres oats, 100 acres sunflowers. Each crop had different expected yields, different price points, different input costs, and different buyers. The math was messier, but when she stress-tested it against low prices on all fronts simultaneously, the floor was higher than the monocrop floor. She circled the bottom line on column 4 and set down the pencil. She called her neighbor, Roy Detmer, the next morning. Roy had farmed 900 acres of wheat for 22 years without diversifying once. He was good at it. His yields were consistently above county average. His equipment was purpose-built and maintained well. He was a disciplined, intelligent farmer. Roy's answer was immediate. You're going to complicate everything for a hedge that might not pay off. Stick with what you know. Prices come back. She didn't argue. She asked what his loan exposure was. He told her it was manageable. She asked what manageable meant at $2, $50 wheat. He said he'd figure it out if it got there. Two other neighbors said similar things. One of them, Frank Giesica, was less polite about it. You want to run around changing seed plates on that old clunker while the rest of us are halfway done planting? You'll lose 2 weeks. He wasn't wrong about the time. The old drill was slower. Transitions between crops would cost her days. She would not be maximizing yield per acre on any single crop. She was not attempting to win the season. She was attempting to survive it if the season went wrong. The distinction mattered. She wasn't sure her neighbors understood it, or if they did, whether they believed it applied to them. She serviced the old drill herself over 3 days. New bearings on the drive shaft, cleaned and lubricated the seed fingers, replaced 2 cracked seed tubes, pulled the chart from inside the toolbox lid, the one that showed seed plate configurations for different crop types, and found it still readable despite the grease and age. She ran the drill empty for 20 minutes in the driveway, checking the metering, watching the seed flow rate. It worked. Slower than the pneumatic, louder, more demanding of attention, but it worked. She configured it for wheat first and started on the north sections of the original parcel, ground she knew well, that had been in wheat for years and drained correctly. 600 acres of wheat. She planted those in the first 2 weeks, working long days to make up time against the slower equipment. Then she stopped. Changed the seed plates over a Sunday afternoon with a socket set and the configuration chart. Loaded the grain sorghum seed she'd ordered and had been keeping dry in the barn. Moved to the newly acquired Kellerman ground. Heavier soil, flatter, good for sorghum's deeper root structure. Her neighbors' fields were already uniform and green in the distance. All wheat, all consistent, all pointing toward the same price. She was planting into 3 different futures simultaneously. Exports froze. The freeze didn't expire. By May, it was clear Washington wasn't backing down. The Soviet trade situation had not improved. If anything, diplomatic channels had tightened further. The Futures Board continued to show pressure on wheat. Grain sorghum was soft, but not as collapsed. Domestic cattle feeders were still buying. The oats market was quiet, but stable. The consolidated elevator reduced its intake limit again in May. Dale Pryor sent a postcard to all his regular sellers. Effective immediately, the elevator would be operating by appointment only and capping daily intake at 2,000 bushels. She called to schedule an appointment for her stored wheat and got a date 3 weeks out. 3 weeks of continued holding cost, continued uncertainty about price direction. She did not panic. Panicking wouldn't change the Futures Board. She adjusted. She called a sunflower crushing cooperative in western Kansas and asked about contract terms. They were buying. The prices weren't extraordinary, but they were domestic, and domestic meant the price wasn't hostage to the same export policy that was compressing wheat. She signed a contract for 70% of expected sunflower output at a fixed price, locking in revenue on that portion before the seeds were even in the ground. That contract was not exciting. It was not a windfall. It was a floor. Floors matter more than ceilings when the ceiling is already in question. Planting finished in late May behind schedule on the diversified acres, but not critically so. She walked the fields on a morning in early June when the first emergence was visible. The wheat sections looked normal, consistent, dense, the way wheat always looked when it came in even. The sorghum sections were spotty in the first week, then filled in by the second. Oats came in fast, the way they usually do. The sunflower sections were the most uneven, a result of soil variation on the new ground she hadn't fully characterized yet. Uneven emergence on the sunflowers meant variable yield. That was a real cost of the diversified plan. She had taken on crops she had less experience with, on ground she knew less well, using equipment that was slower to reconfigure. None of that was free. Diversification wasn't a free lunch. It was a trade. Lower upside for a higher floor. She wrote that down on the legal pad where she'd been keeping field notes, not as a philosophical statement, as an accounting entry. June brought heat, which the wheat handled well, and the sorghum handled better. July brought dry conditions, not drought, but enough pressure to reduce wheat yield per acre by roughly 8% against her estimate. The final wheat harvest came in at approximately 35 bushels per acre on the planted acres, slightly below her conservative projection. The price she received on delivered wheat was $2. 84 per bushel, not $3. 20, not $2. 52 by 84. The market had stabilized at a level below the pre-freeze baseline and showed no signs of a strong recovery. The export freeze was still in effect. Storage at the elevator was still constrained. Her monocrop neighbors delivered their wheat into the same market at the same price. Roy Detmer harvested strong yields, 41 bushels per acre on his best ground. But $2, 84 per bushel on 900 acres of wheat against his own input and loan costs, left him with margins he described over the phone as workable, barely. He had no other revenue stream. His July loan payment came out of wheat receipts alone. He made it. He told her so in the same tone a man uses when he's describing something that almost didn't happen. Her sorghum sold into the domestic feed market at $2, 61 per hundredweight, not exceptional, but stable. The oats sold through a regional feed cooperative. The sunflowers delivered against her locked contract price. Each crop had its own harvest window, its own logistics, its own paperwork. Managing 4 crop types across 1,120 acres with her existing labor, herself and 1 seasonal hired hand, was harder than single crop operations. She logged more hours per acre in management time. She made mistakes on the sunflower harvest timing that cost her roughly 4% of yield to shattering in the field. None of this was efficient. Efficiency is a measurement optimized for stable conditions. She wasn't operating in stable conditions. She was operating in a market that had shifted sharply and showed no signs of reversing before her next loan payment. The October payment was $9,400. She made it. The January payment was the same. She made that one too. She wasn't ahead. She wasn't accumulating reserves. But she wasn't falling behind. By the winter of 1985, the farm crisis was no longer a background economic story. It was front page. Foreclosures in Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota were accelerating. Farms that had purchased land at peak valuations in the early 80s, financed at high fixed rates, planted in single crops whose prices had collapsed under the combined pressure of export disruption and domestic oversupply, were running out of runway. The Federal Reserve's interest rate policy had already compressed margins for years. The export freeze was the additional pressure that pushed highly leveraged single crop operations past the point of recovery. Margaret knew 2 farmers who filed for bankruptcy before the year was out. Both had stronger yields than she did. One of them had better soil. Neither of them had diversified their revenue or their market exposure. They had been efficient. They had maximized yield. They had done everything right for the conditions that existed before the freeze. And then the conditions changed, and there was no buffer. The difference between her situation and theirs wasn't land quality or farming skill. It was the structure of the bet. She pulled the canvas tarp back over the old grain drill in November. The machine had put in a full season. It had been slow, loud, and demanding. It had required her to stop and reconfigure between crop types in ways the pneumatic drill would never have required. It had cost her efficiency. It had also given her the flexibility to not be fully exposed to a single price signal in a year when that price signal went wrong. Flexibility is invisible in good years. In a year when wheat at $3.40 was assumed and wheat at $2. 84 was reality. Flexibility was the difference between making loan payments and missing them. The exports stayed frozen. The prices didn't recover. The neighboring farms that had come through the year were the ones with lower leverage, diversified revenue, or both. The ones that hadn't made it had often been technically superior operations, better equipment, better yields, better single crop execution, running inside a system that had just changed the rules. This isn't a story about old equipment. The drill was a tool. It mattered because it enabled a decision that the other drill made harder to implement. The decision was the thing. The decision was, don't bet everything on one market when that market is showing signs of structural instability. Don't optimize for maximum output when the price of that output is uncertain. Don't let efficiency in good conditions blind you to fragility in bad ones. Exports froze, prices fell, margins tightened. The drill kept planting, not because it was special, but because someone had decided to use it for a purpose that the rest of the county thought was unnecessary. Sometimes survival isn't about producing more. It's about depending on less. If you think this kind of structural thinking matters, in farming, in business, in any system where conditions change without warning, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and they don't get told often enough.